All right, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on reading comprehension.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, we're looking at research on how to help folks who struggle with reading
Mhm.
to really get what's going on in a text, understand it.
Really make sense of it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And, you sent over this fascinating scientific article,
Uh-huh.
and our goal today is to break it down, pull out the key findings about something called inference instruction.
Right.
Think of it as like, your cheat sheet to
Sure.
understanding this really crucial part of reading.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about getting to the core of how we as readers, create meaning, especially when it's not explicitly stated.
Right. Yeah.
Whether we're talking about, reports for work or trying to help someone learn how to read or, even just understanding how our own minds work when we're reading,
Yeah, absolutely.
grasping this whole idea of making inferences, like reading between the lines.
Reading between the lines.
It's super fundamental.
Yeah, for sure. And our guide for this deep dive is this big research paper, Inference Instruction for Struggling Readers, a synthesis of intervention research, Colby S. Hall, back in 2016.
Oh, okay, yeah.
What's really cool about this article is that it's not just looking at one single study.
Right.
It's bringing together 9 different studies that all focused on teaching these inference skills, but specifically to readers who are having a hard time with comprehension.
Right.
So we're getting this like broad evidence-based picture of what actually, according to the research, works.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that right off the bat, it highlights for you as a reader the strong connection between your ability to make inferences and just reading comprehension in general.
Okay.
Like they found that even when they accounted for things like how well someone can decode words, how big their vocabulary is, even like their overall cognitive abilities, the ability to infer meaning still stands out as a big predictor of how well they understand what they're reading. And this isn't just true for, one age group. It goes from, preschoolers all the way up to older elementary intermediate students.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit because I think that's important.
Yeah.
You're saying that even if someone can sound out every single word in, let's say, a news article, right?
Yeah.
If they can't make those connections in their head to understand what is being implied, not directly stated, then their comprehension is going to be limited.
Right.
And it's interesting that this article points to how this is important in education standards now, which really emphasize that students need to go beyond the surface of the text and analyze those deeper meanings.
Exactly. It's not just about knowing the facts.
Right.
It's about understanding the why, the how.
Right, that deeper level.
Yes.
Okay, so now it gets really interesting for anyone who's working with a struggling reader or even just thinking about their own reading. Right?
Yes.
The research seems to show that struggling readers tend to have more difficulty making these inferences than, let's say, more proficient readers.
Right. And here's the thing, though. This is where it gets encouraging. They might actually benefit more from explicit instruction in how to make inferences.
Okay, so that's a good point, right?
Yeah.
It's not that they're incapable,
Yeah.
but they maybe haven't developed these strategies that more fluent readers might pick up just naturally, implicitly.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so when we talk about inference, what do we mean in the context of reading?
Right.
This article uses this term situation model, which you as a reader build in your mind.
Right. So you can think of it as like constructing your own mental movie as you're reading. This situation model is kind of this network of like ideas, facts, and events that come from the text, but also includes all the background knowledge and experiences that you're bringing to it as a reader.
Gotcha.
And the inferences are kind of like the glue that holds this network together.
Okay.
So it's the leaps you make in your mind to connect what's directly stated to what you need to figure out to like fully grasp the meaning.
It's not just like remembering facts from, let's say, a document, but really understanding how they all relate to each other and what they actually suggest.
Yeah, for sure.
And the article actually breaks down different types of inferences, which I found really fascinating.
Right.
Can you kind of walk us through that, especially, how we might see these in our own reading?
Yeah, sure. So the article kind of makes a distinction between text connecting inferences and gap filling inferences. So text connecting inferences, those are where you're using clues from within the text itself to make a connection. So if you're reading a story and it says, the chef was angry, he threw the spatula down, you infer that he refers to the chef.
Right.
Like the answer is right there in the sentences.
Yeah.
You're connecting those linguistic cues.
Gotcha. So it's like following the threads that the author has laid out for you in the actual word.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and then we have gap-filling inferences, which sound like they require a bit more from the reader.
Right. So gap-filling inferences require you to go beyond the text and bring in your own knowledge or understanding of how the world works.
Yeah.
They break it down even further into like necessary and elaborative gap-filling inferences. So necessary ones, those are essential for basic comprehension. So like, for example, the article gives this example. The campfire started to burn uncontrollably. Tom grabbed a bucket of water.
Okay.
So to understand why Tom grabbed the water, that connection between fire and water, you have to draw on your own knowledge that water puts out fire.
Right, because otherwise Tom's actions just seem random.
Exactly. And then we have like elaborative gap-filling inferences, which enrich our understanding but aren't strictly necessary to understand the main point.
Okay.
So like, if you read that a character slammed a door and was muttering under their breath, you might infer that they're angry.
Right.
That adds depth to your understanding of their emotional state, but you could still understand the plot without making that inference.
Right.
And research suggests that struggling readers often have more difficulty with these gap-filling inferences, especially the necessary ones compared to the text-connecting ones. They may not activate or apply their prior knowledge as readily.
That's really important for anyone who's working with a struggling reader, or even, if you're reading something that's in a field you're not super familiar with.
Right.
They might be able to follow the surface connections, but when they have to bring in outside knowledge, that's where they struggle.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so let's talk about the research itself. This synthesis looked at 9 studies that were specifically about improving these inference skills in struggling readers. What did they find overall? Like, was this type of instruction actually effective in helping them?
So the overall finding was that inference instruction can be effective in improving, inferential reading comprehension for struggling readers. They found that there were positive effect sizes in these group studies.
Okay, so can you explain what an effect size is?
Yeah, so effect size is basically a measure of how much of an impact the teaching had,
Right.
right? So positive effect sizes suggest like a genuine noticeable improvement.
Okay.
And the single case study that they looked at, there was also a strong positive effect.
So it's not just a theoretical idea, but in practice, teaching these skills actually helped improve comprehension.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's fantastic. Okay, so what kinds of teaching techniques did they actually use? What showed the most promise in these studies? Something that might be useful for someone who's supporting a reader, or even just for us to think about.
Right, so several approaches really stood out as being helpful.
Okay.
One was focusing on identifying and integrating keywords.
Yeah.
So some of the studies involved teaching students to really actively find important words and then use those words as clues to answer questions.
Right, okay.
There was even this technique called lexical inference training, where students learn to link those clue words together to figure out like the setting of the story or different plot points. It's like becoming a detective,
Yeah, looking for the clues.
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so other than this idea of identifying and using keywords, what other techniques seem to be effective?
Right. So another one was activating prior knowledge.
Yeah.
Some of the successful studies encourage students to think about their own experiences or anything they already knew about the topic before they even started reading.
Gotcha.
This helps build those connections between the text and their existing knowledge.
Okay, so it's almost like warming up their brain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you can relate to what you're reading on a personal level, obviously it's easier to understand.
Right.
The article also mentions combining prior knowledge with those keywords we just talked about.
Right. So one particular intervention called the INFR strategy that taught students to interact directly with the text and the questions, take note of their own prior knowledge, look for clues, really explore those details, and then return back to the question and formulate an answer. So it's kind of a multi-step, very deliberate process to really guide their thinking.
Yeah, like having a checklist in your head.
Exactly.
Okay, that's cool. And what was really surprising is that the article also talked about the act of generating your own questions and even just answering inference questions. Like that in itself can be helpful.
Right. So some of the interventions had students actually create their own questions, which forces them to really think about those implied meanings and consider what's not being said directly.
Okay.
And even more surprisingly, one study suggested that just giving struggling readers more chances to answer inference questions after they finish reading, that alone could be just as helpful as more complex strategies.
Interesting.
It shows the power of practice and really actively engaging with the text on a deeper level.
Yeah, sometimes the simplest approach is the best. Okay, given that these studies looked at a range of students with different, levels of reading difficulty, different ages, were there any factors that didn't seem to affect how well the instruction worked?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, actually. So the effectiveness didn't really seem to consistently depend on things like the student's specific grade level.
Okay.
It worked for students all the way from second to ninth grade.
Wow.
It also didn't seem to depend on whether they had a specific learning disability, their socioeconomic status, or even the type of text they were reading, like whether it was a story or something else.
Interesting.
Even whether the teacher was a researcher or their regular classroom teacher didn't seem to make a difference.
Wow.
But having said that, smaller group instruction or one-on-one instruction did seem to be effective, while a study with larger class sizes didn't show the same benefits.
So it seems like the teaching approach itself was more important than, some of the other factors.
Yeah, it does seem that way, but maybe that learning environment plays a role.
Right, that makes sense. And the article hinted at this idea that different kinds of struggling readers, different types, might need slightly different approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. One study suggested that there are different subgroups, like those who add a lot of their own interpretations, who they called elaborators, and those who stick very closely to the literal words paraphrasers.
Gotcha.
And those groups might actually benefit from different types of questions, like elaborators might benefit from questions that push them to make causal connections, while paraphrasers might benefit from more general questions that encourage broader connections.
Okay, so that suggests that we need to think about how we can personalize this type of instruction.
Yeah, for sure.
Because not every struggling reader is facing the same exact challenge.
Right.
Okay, so as with any research, there are always limitations. What did the article point out about these studies?
Yeah, so there were several limitations they noted. One was that only a small number of studies actually met their criteria for being included in this synthesis, which just emphasizes the need for more research in this area.
Right.
And then a lot of the studies that were included had some methodological limitations, like some didn't have very detailed ways of measuring inference skills.
Okay, yeah.
Or maybe their comparison groups weren't well matched. So, this makes it a little harder to draw really strong conclusions.
Right, so while these findings are very promising, there's definitely room for more research.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, so what are the key takeaways? Not just for educators, but for, everyone out there.
Yeah, so for educators, it just reiterates the importance of directly teaching these skills,
Mm.
helping students identify keywords, encouraging them to make connections to their own knowledge before they read, and giving them lots of chances to practice through questioning.
And for the rest of us.
Yeah, even if you're not an educator, these findings are still super valuable. You know, consciously paying attention to those keywords when you're reading something complex, actively trying to link new information to what you already know, asking yourself questions about what's implied, these are all skills you can develop to improve your own comprehension, whether you're reading, research, news, whatever.
Yeah, it's about shifting from passive reading to active reading.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so what are some of the questions that this research still leaves us with? What are the things that we need to explore more?
Yeah, so which parts of those multi-step strategies are the most effective?
Okay,
Do different kinds of text require different approaches to teaching inference?
right.
And how do we make the benefits of this instruction last? Only one study had a follow-up, and it seemed like those positive effects could fade over time.
Okay, so we need more research on how to make these skills stick for the long haul.
Absolutely.
All right, as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's one final thought you want to leave our listeners with? Something they can consider as they go about their day encountering new information.
I would just say, think about how you approach reading complex information.
Okay.
Could you try using some of these techniques?
Okay.
Before you dive into that next big report, take a second, think about what you already know about the topic.
Okay.
And as you read, look for connections between different ideas and really try to read between the lines. Think about what's being implied, but not explicitly stated.
Yeah.
Because, making inferences, it's not something you're just born without. It's a skill you can learn and use to understand the world around you.
That's a great point to end on. We encourage you to think about your own reading habits, whether any of this could be helpful for you or someone you know. And if you have any more thoughts or questions, definitely share them. We are, after all, learning together here on The Deep Dive. Thanks for being with us.